Wyoming Territory, July 1873. The plains stretched wide and hot beneath a hard blue sky, and Margaret Calloway's arms burned from carrying her daughter for the third mile that morning. Her boots kicked up dust with each step, and the sun beat down like it had a grudge. But she kept walking. She had no choice. 3 days ago, the wagon wheel snapped clean in half outside Fort Laramie. The trader who'd offered her passage west had said he'd come back, but Margaret knew better than to trust a man who drank before noon and couldn't remember her name. So she packed what she could carry, hoisted little Josephine onto her hip, and started walking across the plains toward Sweetwater. Josephine had stopped crying that morning. Now she just pressed her hot cheek against Margaret's collarbone, too tired to speak, her little arms limp around her mother's neck. Margaret shifted the girl higher and kept walking. She had not eaten since dawn the day before. Her lips were cracked. Her feet blistered. She had the look of a woman who had run out of prayers. The wind picked up, brushing over the tall grass in steady waves. Somewhere out ahead, hooves pounded against the earth. Margaret paused and turned her face toward the sound. A lone rider was coming over the rise. She did not flinch, did not hide, just stood there, swaying a little from the weight of her child, her eyes squinting against the sun. The rider slowed as he drew closer. A tall man, lean, with dust in his hair and a rifle slung across his back. He wore a weathered duster and carried himself like someone who had spent more nights under the stars than under a roof. He stopped a few feet away and took off his hat. "You look like you could use some help," he said, voice low and steady. Margaret didn't answer. He looked at Josephine, then back at her. "You headed somewhere?" "Sweetwater," she said, throat dry. "We were supposed to have a wagon." He looked at the girl sagging in her mother's arms, then at Margaret's trembling hands. "You're about to drop," he said. "Let me carry you both." Her knees buckled just a little. "Who are you?" "Thatcher O'Malley." He swung down from the saddle and stepped closer. "My ranch sits 6 miles east." "You're walking the wrong direction." Margaret hesitated, arms tightening around Josephine. "I am not looking to be saved," she said. Thatcher nodded. "I am not looking to be a savior. Just a man who cannot ride past a girl and her mama dying in the middle of nowhere." Something broke in her then. Not a full collapse. Just a breath, shaky and small, as her grip gave out. Thatcher reached for Josephine first. "I got her," he said gently, lifting the child into his arms. Josephine stirred and whimpered. Then he looked at Margaret. "I'll get you both on the horse. You ride." "I'll walk." "I can walk," she tried. He met her eyes. "You have been. And now it's enough." She gave a tired nod. He helped her into the saddle behind her daughter. She held Josephine close. Thatcher's coat draped over both of them, and they turned east. Hours passed in dry silence, save for the creak of leather and the wind in the grass. Thatcher walked beside the horse, one hand on the reins, the other shielding his eyes from the sun. Margaret watched him from above, the way he checked on her every few minutes without a word, the quiet strength in his gait, the calm he carried like it had weight. By the time they reached his ranch, a low-built cabin nestled in a patch of cottonwoods with a red barn behind it, Josephine was asleep, and Margaret was too tired to speak. Thatcher helped them down, carried the girl inside, and set her gently on the cot in the corner. "You can rest here," he said softly. "I will fetch water." Margaret's legs gave out the moment he stepped away. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, her arms wrapped around her middle. When he came back, he did not speak right away. Just handed her the tin cup and sat across from her, letting the silence settle. She drank. Then, finally, she looked at him. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because you needed it. And because I would want someone to do the same for my sister, if she were out there alone." Margaret blinked. "Do you have a sister?" He shook his head. "No, but I would have liked one." She watched him for a moment longer, then leaned her head back and closed her eyes. That night, Thatcher cooked cornbread and beans on the stove. Margaret ate like someone remembering how. Josephine woke long enough to sip water and fall back asleep. Thatcher offered Margaret the cot, took the floor without asking. She watched him roll out a thin blanket and settle in with his back to the door. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not turn. "You are safe now." And in that small, quiet room, with the wind whispering through the chinks in the wood and the stars bright outside, Margaret believed him. For the first time in weeks, she believed. She lay down beside her daughter. Thatcher's coat still tucked around them, and let herself sleep. Morning cracked slow and golden over the cottonwoods, their leaves trembling in the breeze like they weren't sure yet if summer would stay. Inside the one-room cabin, the air held the scent of wood smoke and earth, warmed by the stove and the rising light. Margaret stirred before Josephine did, her body aching in places that hadn't hurt yesterday. She sat up on the edge of the cot, trying to remember the last time she'd slept through the night. Her dress was stiff with salt and sweat, her boots lined with grit, but she felt clearer. The fear that had clung to her like a second skin had loosened, just enough to let her breathe without flinching. Across the room, Thatcher was already on his feet, crouched near the hearth, feeding kindling into the iron stove. He didn't look over, just added another split log and shut the door with care. "You slept hard," he said after a moment. "I did," she answered. "I didn't mean to. It was needed." He straightened and dusted his hands on his trousers. "There's coffee," he added. Weak, but warm. She rose and crossed to the table, where a tin cup waited beside a chipped enamel pot. She poured, steady-handed, and blew on the rim before sipping. It was bitter and thin, but it steadied her. Josephine stirred, rolled toward the wall, then went still again. "She's still warm," Margaret said quietly, setting the cup down. "Let her rest. She's got catching up to do." Margaret nodded. She touched her daughter's hair briefly, then turned back to him. "You live here alone?" "For now." She studied the sparse room bedroll folded in the corner, shelves lined with tools and dry goods, a saddle tack resting against the far wall. "For now," she repeated. "That mean you're waiting on someone?" He wiped soot from his knuckles with a bit of cloth. "Not exactly." She waited. "There was a time I thought I might marry." "She chose another," he said simply. Margaret didn't press. Instead, she picked up her cup again and took another measured sip. He moved toward the door and paused with his hand on the latch. "I've got stock to check. Creek's low this time of year, and the fence down by the east pasture needs shoring. You're welcome to the place while I'm gone." "I can help," she said. Thatcher turned. "You've done enough walking." "I didn't say I'd walk," she replied, brushing a hand over her skirt. "I can mend. Patch whatever clothes need it. If you've got a needle and thread." For the first time, his mouth bent at the corner. Not in amusement, but something like respect. "In the box under the shelf," he said, and stepped outside. She found it where he said neatly coiled thread, a few worn needles, a thimble that had seen better days. Beside it was a bundle of shirts with fraying cuffs and a pair of trousers missing half a hem. By the time Josephine woke, Margaret had stitched 3 seams and set a pot of water to boil. Her hands moved steady over the fabric, her thoughts quieter than they'd been in weeks. Josephine blinked at the ceiling, then turned toward her. "Where are we?" "In a place where you're safe." The girl sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. "Is this our house?" "No, sweetheart. It's Mr. O'Malley's. He brought us here to rest." Josephine's gaze shifted to the door. "Is he nice?" Margaret paused, then folded the shirt and looked at her daughter. "Yes, he is." Josephine nodded, like that was enough, and padded to the stove. Margaret poured her a cup of cooled broth from last night's pot, and the girl drank without complaint. Later, Thatcher returned with his sleeves rolled and his boots caked in mud. He stopped just inside the door, taking in the scent of soap and the new length of patched fabric hanging by the hearth like a small flag of progress. "You've been busy," he said. "So have you." He looked over at Josephine, who was drawing shapes in the dust on the floor with a stick. "She's quiet. She watches first," Margaret said, "then decides." Thatcher crouched beside the girl, not too close. "What did you draw there?" Josephine held up the stick. "It's a bird, but I think I forgot how wings go." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, flat stone. "You hang on to this. Smooth enough for drawing in the dirt. Won't splinter." Josephine took it solemnly, then looked to her mother. Margaret gave a small nod. "Thank you," the girl said. "You're welcome." He rose and set down a bundle of fresh-cut wood by the stove. "Storm's coming in from the mountains," he said. "You're welcome to stay till it clears." Margaret hesitated. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "You're not." He met her eyes, calm and certain. "You're here. That's enough." The warmth that rose in her chest startled her a slow, unfamiliar ease. She turned back to her mending, not trusting her voice. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing through the cottonwoods like a hush too big for words. Inside the cabin, 3 people moved through the quiet like they were figuring out how to share it. The storm didn't break until after dusk. It started with a low roll of thunder that rumbled across the plains like distant wagons. Then came the wind, sharp and insistent through the gaps in the cabin walls. Thatcher stood by the window, one hand braced on the frame, watching the sway of the cottonwoods. Margaret knelt by the hearth, coaxing a slow flame into steadier life. Josephine sat near her, humming beneath her breath as she traced the edge of a threadbare quilt. "You ever see rain like this where you're from?" Thatcher asked without turning. Margaret tucked her hair behind her ear. "Not this far across. I grew up near the Missouri, where storms blow in quick and burn out faster." He stepped away from the window, wiping his palms on his trousers. "By morning the creek might rise. We'll keep close here tomorrow. I can make bread," she said, "if you've got flour and something to leaven with. There's a bit of sour left in the crock. Been a while since I used it." She nodded, then turned to Josephine. "You remember the biscuits Aunt Ruth made every Sunday?" The girl's face brightened. "With the honey butter?" Margaret smiled, faint and warm. "Just like those." Thatcher crossed to the shelf above the counter and pulled down a tin. "I'll leave you to it, if that's your way of keeping busy." She accepted it without comment, dusted her hands on her skirt, and began measuring by feel. He watched her move through the small space with quiet purpose. She didn't waste motion. Her sleeves were rolled, and her jaw held a steady set, like someone who'd spent years pressing forward because stopping was never an option. "You work in a kitchen before?" he asked. "I worked wherever I could. Boarding house in St. Joseph for a time. Before that, laundry." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, not crowding her. "You leave much behind?" Margaret looked up from the mixing bowl. "Not much that missed me." She stirred once more, then added, "My husband died 3 winters past. Illness took him quick." Josephine was 4. Thatcher didn't speak right away. The fire crackled, and rain ticked against the roof. "You come west for work?" "I came west because there was nothing east worth staying for." He nodded, the kind of nod that didn't ask for more. "What about you?" she asked, setting the dough aside beneath a cloth. "This place yours from kin?" "No. I bought it from a man heading to California. He buried 2 sons and didn't want to die looking at that same stretch of land." Josephine had fallen asleep again, curled in the quilt with one hand tucked beneath her cheek. Margaret pulled the kettle closer to the heat. "You ever think of leaving?" Thatcher glanced at the door. "I did once. Then I realized I didn't need more land. Just a reason to stay on the piece I had." She didn't answer, but her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than before. The wind howled against the eaves, and a loose shutter banged once, then settled. Thatcher moved to the back wall and lifted a small wooden chest. From it, he drew out a folded square of muslin. "This was my mother's," he said. "She used it to cover bread while it rose. Figured it might serve better than that worn cloth." Margaret accepted it without touching his hand. "Thank you." He hesitated, then ran a thumb along the edge of the chest. "She taught me how to make salt pork stew. Said a man ought to know how to feed himself, in case he had to." "That's a smart woman." She was. Didn't say much, but she had a way of seeing what was coming before it got here. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. "What do you think she'd see now?" He looked at her, slow and steady. "A woman who don't ask for pity. A girl who watches everything but scares easy. And a man who's thinking more than he's saying." Margaret held his gaze. "And what's he thinking?" "That he wouldn't mind hearing you laugh." She looked down, lips pressed together, then back up. "It's been a while." "That's all right." He leaned back against the wall. "I've got time." They didn't speak again until the dough had risen and the coals settled. She baked the bread directly in the cast-iron pan, flipping it once when the edges browned. By the time she laid it on the table, the storm outside had eased to a steady patter. They ate without hurry. Josephine, still drowsy, chewed with her eyes half closed. Thatcher passed her a slice with molasses on it, and she gave a soft, pleased sound. Margaret touched her daughter's cheek. "She'll sleep deep tonight. You both should." Margaret turned to him. "You don't strike me as a man used to company." "I'm not. But you left your own bedroll for a child and a stranger." He didn't shift. Didn't feel like much of a choice. She rubbed her thumb along the edge of her cup. It was. He looked down at the table, then back up. It was the right one. For the first time, Her mouth curved not wide, not showy. Just a quiet turn, like something long forgotten finding its shape again. She stood and began clearing the dishes without being asked. He rose to help. By the time the fire burned low and the shutters stopped rattling, the room had taken on the kind of hush that didn't need filling. Margaret laid Josephine back on the cot and tucked the quilt around her again. As she turned, Thatcher handed her a rolled blanket. "There's room near the hearth," he said. "It'll stay warm through the night." She took it, nodded once, then looked at him fully. "Good night, Mr. O'Malley." His voice was quiet. "It's Thatcher." She didn't answer, just moved to the hearth, spread the blanket, and lay down within reach of the glowing coals. He sat back on the bench by the door, his hand resting loosely on his knee. Outside, the plains breathed deep beneath the soft hush of rain. Inside, something new had settled. Not comfort, not yet, but the beginning of it. The wind had quieted by morning, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and a soft hush across the grasslands. Mist clung to the creek and drifted low through the cottonwoods, blurring the edges of the world beyond the cabin windows. Margaret stepped outside as the sky paled, her boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but to feel something solid. The early light softened the sharp lines of the land, and for a moment, she forgot about the miles behind her. Thatcher was already in the barn, the low scuff of hooves and the murmur of his voice drifting out. Margaret didn't move toward it. Instead, she bent to check the water barrel beside the porch, dipping a tin pail beneath the sloshing surface. Her reflection wavered in the ripples, eyes darker than they once were, a mouth held tight from too many kept thoughts. Inside, Josephine still slept, one hand tucked beneath her chin, the other curled around the smooth stone Thatcher had given her. Margaret paused in the doorway, watching the slow rise and fall of her daughter's back. She poured water into the basin and scrubbed her hands, then her face, leaning down to rinse her hairline. The chill braced her. She dried with a cloth and turned just as the barn door creaked open. Thatcher strode across the yard, sleeves rolled, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. His shirt was damp at the collar, and a streak of mud clung to his boot. "Creek didn't rise too bad," he said, setting the rope beside the porch. "Found the calf I'd been looking for." He wandered past the fence line. Margaret nodded. "He all right. Thin, but standing. He'll fatten up again." She stepped aside to let him through the door. "There's coffee on. It's stronger today." He poured a cup and leaned against the table, blowing across the top. "You ever think about staying on somewhere?" he asked. Margaret glanced at him. "You mean here?" "Here, or anywhere that don't require walking across half the country." She folded the cloth and set it aside. "I think about a lot of things. Most of them come down to what Josephine needs." He took a sip, then set the cup down. "And what do you need?" She didn't answer right away. She crossed to the hearth, adjusted the damper, and looked into the slow burning coals. "I need a place where she can sleep through the night without listening for wagons. A place where I don't have to trade my hands for a meal that won't last." Thatcher rested his hand on the back of a chair. "You wouldn't have to trade anything here." "That's kind of you," she said quietly. "But kindness wears thin when it gets heavy." "It doesn't if it's real." She turned to face him. "And is it?" He met her eyes. "It is." They stood in silence then, the kind that didn't press but waited. Josephine stirred and sat up, hair tangled, eyes still heavy with sleep. She rubbed at one cheek and blinked toward them. Margaret crossed to her, brushing the hair from her daughter's forehead. "You hungry?" Josephine nodded. Thatcher pulled a jar of oats from the shelf, set a pot of water to boil, and spoke without looking up. "I was thinking about building a second hen house. The ground's soft enough now, after the rain. Could use a hand if someone's willing." Margaret looked at him. "I've hammered boards before." "I figured you had." Later that afternoon, they worked side by side beneath a sky stitched with pale clouds. Josephine sat nearby with a scrap of wood and a piece of coal, drawing long-legged animals with crooked horns. Margaret held the frame steady while Thatcher lowered the beam into place. His arm brushed hers when he reached for the next nail, and neither of them pulled away. "You build all this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it. Took a neighbor's help with the roof. The rest came slow." She adjusted her grip. "I know something about slow." He looked at her then, not as a man measuring words, but as someone seeing another soul hold their own weight. By dusk, the henhouse stood firm, the door hung even, the roof angled to drain toward the creek. They sat on the porch afterward, boots muddy, hands sore, but shoulders easier than before. Josephine dozed with her head in Margaret's lap, her face turned toward the last of the light. Thatcher passed a tin cup to Margaret. I found some dried peppermint. Figured it might steep into something decent. She took it, inhaled the faint scent, and sipped. It's better than decent. He shifted slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. You could stay, just for a while, until you figure where you're headed. Margaret looked down at her daughter's face, soft in sleep. She brushed a curl from her brow and watched Josephine stir, then settle again. I think, she said slowly, that I'd like to stay until the frost. Then stay until the frost. Their eyes met, and there was no urgency in it. No promise made too soon. Just the quiet understanding of two people who'd learned the worth of steadiness. The sun dropped low, casting long shadows across the yard. The air cooled and the wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage and damp earth across the plains. Margaret leaned back against the cabin wall, her fingers resting lightly on Josephine's shoulder. Thatcher didn't move, but something in his gaze softened, like a man who'd finally set down a weight he'd carried too long. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The silence between them held, and it held well. The frost came early that year. By late September, the cottonwoods turned brittle gold, their leaves dropping with each sigh of wind. The grass browned along the creek, and Margaret began drawing water before dawn to beat the chill. Each morning, she wrapped Josephine in a quilt before lifting her from the cot, carrying her still half asleep to the bench near the stove. The girl had grown fuller in the cheeks, steadier on her feet, less shadow, more child. Thatcher had finished the root cellar by then, hammering the final plank into place on a windless afternoon while Margaret hung strips of venison to dry. They worked in rhythm now, without needing to speak. When he passed her the last of the nails, her fingers brushed his for the briefest moment. Neither of them pulled away. That night, after Josephine had fallen asleep tracing letters with a stub of charcoal on the back of a feed sack, Thatcher poured 2 cups of chicory brew and lit the lantern. Margaret sat across from him at the table, her hands still bearing faint creases from the twine she'd used to bind squash for storage. You ever think of teaching? He asked, his thumb resting on the handle of his tin cup. I did once, she said. But only in stolen hours. My husband didn't think much of books. Thatcher watched her closely. And you did. I did. Still do. He nodded slowly. We've got a schoolhouse west of the ridge, but no one teaching in it anymore. The last woman left for Illinois after her father took ill. Margaret looked at the lantern's glow flickering on the tabletop. I don't have letters behind my name. You've got patience. And a calm hand. That's more than most. She didn't answer right away. The silence between them had grown easy, unpressured. I'd need time, she said finally, to find my footing. It's been years since I held chalk. You've got time, he said. The next morning, Margaret asked him to walk with her to the schoolhouse. Josephine rode atop the mare Thatcher had gentled earlier that spring, her hands clutched in the horse's mane. The wind carried the scent of pine and dry hay, and the sky stretched wide and pale above the hills. The schoolhouse sat on a small rise, its white paint faded, the front step warped from snowmelt. Inside, dust clung to the windows, and old slates leaned uneasily in the corners. Margaret stepped in slowly, her fingertips trailing along the shelves where primers once stood. Josephine wandered to the front bench and sat, swinging her legs. Margaret turned to Thatcher. It's quiet. It's been waiting. She crossed to the blackboard and picked up a stub of chalk left behind. It crumbled in her grip, but the feel of it stirred something steady in her chest. I could try, she said. If someone's willing to vouch for me, I'll speak to the marshal. He knows me. She nodded, then smiled not wide, but real. They rode back with the sun behind them, the shadows stretching long and familiar across the field. That evening, Margaret braided Josephine's hair by the hearth while Thatcher carved notches into a post outside to mark the growth of the calf born midsummer. By late October, Margaret had begun teaching 3 days a week. Children from nearby homesteads arrived in boots too big, some still smelling faintly of smoke and livestock. She welcomed each one by name. Josephine sat at the front, her stone tucked in her apron pocket. Thatcher made her a writing box from cherry wood he'd traded for. He didn't hand it to her, just left it on the table one morning beside her tea. She ran her fingers over the smooth grain, then opened the lid to find new pencils, a pot of ink, and a folded scrap of muslin to keep the dust out. Later that week, after the last child had gone home and the light turned golden through the tall windows, Margaret stayed behind to wipe the board. She didn't hear Thatcher enter, but she felt his presence before he spoke. "You've made it yours," he said. "It feels borrowed still," she replied. He stepped closer. "Not to them. Not to her." Margaret turned. "And to you?" "To me, it feels like something finally found its place." She let the cloth fall to the ledge beneath the board. "I didn't expect this." "Neither did I." He reached out then, slow and sure, and took her hand. "I've watched you build a life from nothing but will and quiet grit," he said. "I've watched her bloom under your care, and I've felt this place shift because of you." Her fingers curled around his. "I've never been looked at the way you look at me." He stepped closer, until there was no space left between them. "Then let me keep looking." She didn't speak. She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and certain. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was the kind of kiss that settled things. They married at the edge of winter, beneath the bare cottonwoods, with a neighbor's wife reading from the good book and Josephine clutching a small bouquet of dried wildflowers. The wedding meal was simple roast venison, cornbread, and a small apple tart Margaret had made with flour saved for months. Josephine called Thatcher Papa for the first time that night, her voice small but sure. He lifted her into his arms without a word and held her close. As the snow came and went, they built a second room onto the cabin, Margaret's idea, Thatcher's hands. They planted rows of carrots and beans in spring, taught Josephine to read by oil lamp, and hosted lessons in the schoolhouse every week. Thatcher never stopped watching Margaret like she was a quiet miracle, and Margaret never stopped reaching for his hand when the day wound down and the sky went soft. They shared every fire, every silence, every bit of new ground. And they were happy, truly, deeply, quietly happy, just as the plains allowed, and just as they'd earned.